because one of the things I knew was that if you wanted to immigrate to Canada, they had at that time, they may still have this, I'm not sure, a 100-point scale, and you had to get a certain number of points on this scale to be accepted as what was then called a landed immigrant. And so I had a lot of things going for me. I spoke English, and so if you spoke fluent English, I think you got 10 points on that 100-point scale. If you had a high school education, you got so many points. If you had a university degree, you got so many points. A master's or a PhD got you even more points. And of course, you had to have a job as well, right? So in that respect, at least I had my degree under my belt. So that was a good thing, right? So we scampered around. I had to quit my job. I had to cease my lease on the apartment that I was living in. Everybody was cooperative, of course, because, everybody knew what the whole Vietnam thing was all about, that it was not normal times, If you had to break your lease, you had to break it if the military was trying to get their hands on you. So eventually, I didn't have a car back in those days, and neither did Ellen, but my brother and his wife did. And so they, it seems to me, Ellen and I met up with Dennis and Vivian. I can't remember where it was. If they came to Portland, they probably came down to Portland. And the four of us anyway went across the border into Vancouver, and where I was going to make contact with an organization there that was supportive of draft dodgers who are coming into Canada. So you'd go to their office, and they were going to advise you on what to do. Now, mind you, before I had planned that I was going to have weeks and weeks and weeks, to do this. Now I was having to do it on the spur of the moment. So when I went in to see them, they asked me, "Well, do you happen to know anybody living in Canada? Do you have any friends, that you could stay with?" Well, it just so happened, and this is one of those interesting coincidences in life. When I was going to school in Libya, in Tripoli, one of my classmates in grade 11 was a guy by the name of Rick Walcott. Rick was in the school not as a military dependent, which is what most of the students were. His father was with one of the oil companies in Libya, right? We also had people in the school who were there because their parents were in the embassy, the American embassy. It was an interesting mix of kids that we had in that school. So anyway, we were together just for grade 11. And then he returned, I guess, to Canada, with his family. I continued on in Libya until I graduated in grade 12. Well, when I showed up at Lewis and Clark College in September of 1962, lo and behold, there was Rick. And what are the odds that a guy from Calgary in Canada would have gone to the same small college? When you consider all the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of colleges and universities in Canada and the United States, the two of us ended up in the same place. So anyway, he was now, at the time I'm describing, when I was talking to the people in Vancouver, I said, "Well, yeah, I have a friend named Rick Walcott. He's just recently married. He's living in Calgary. He's working with the YMCA there." So they said, "Well, would he be willing, to take you in until you can get established?" And so I said, "Well, I'll contact him and find out." And sure enough, Rick said, "Come on." He and his wife Selena said, "Sure, we'll put you up." So my parting with Ellen was pretty sad. She was just in tears, and I was trying to be the strong masculine type. Well, everything was going to work out okay. I wasn't really feeling all that confident, but I had to be as confident as I could be. So she and my brother and his wife went back across the border. She went back to Seattle because the March break was now spoiled. And Dennis and his wife were living in a place. I'm trying to remember Ellensburg. It's called Ellensburg, Washington. He was going to Central Washington State University there at the time. He was a couple of years younger than I was. So he and his wife were living in Ellensburg at the time. So anyway, so I continued on to Calgary, and this is where it gets a little bit dicey. You could apply for landed immigrant status in Canada if you had a job. but you had to get the job from outside the country, right? So if you were living in, let's say, Wisconsin, and you could apply to some outfit in Ontario who are willing to hire you, at whatever job, and they would send, this application or this acceptance, to your address there in Wisconsin, then, that was playing by the rules of the game. Well, I was actually in the country, right? And I was going looking for jobs from within the country. And I had no luck for the first number of days in Calgary. It wasn't the best time of the year anyway. It was, it was March, the weather was gloomy, overcast. Calgary was not a particularly attractive city at that time, and certainly at that time of the year, it just seemed to be gray and bland, and it was very depressing. And I can remember at one point, after just having one failure after another, trying to track down a job, I just went down. I was in a vacant lot. I sat down in this deserted vacant lot, and I just broke down crying. And that is probably as close as I've ever been in my life to being, I wouldn't say suicidal, but being severely depressed. I can now kind of understand what depression is all about, having gone through that experience. So I don't know how long I sat there in that vacant lot crying, and finally I just sort of shook it off. And I went back over to Rick and Selena's house, and I said, I'm going to head back to the States for a little while. So, crossed the border. It was no trouble crossing the border in those days because there wasn't any computerized system, to discover that. And I hadn't failed to show up for induction because I was still, a little ways down the road, right? So I was able to go back and forth across the border. So I went to Seattle, and I stayed with Ellen in her apartment for a while. And that really, looking back on it, was kind of a selfish thing to do, because I could have implicated her. If a case was brought against me in court, she would be an accomplice, right? If it could be proven that I was staying with her at the time. So it's kind of a selfish thing to do, but I wasn't really thinking about her as much as I was about myself, I suppose, at that time. So I stayed with her while we tried to work out some plan of action. And a very interesting thing happened while I was there. And I mentioned this to you and Carol the other day. This is the longer version of the story. While I was staying with her, she had classes to go to, and I didn't. So I had a lot of time on my hands. And there was a friend of hers, an acquaintance really, not a friend, an acquaintance, and he was a convert to the Greek Orthodox religion, and he was going to become a priest. But to become a priest, you could be married if you were a priest, as you know, but you had to be married before you became a priest, not after you became a priest. So he was looking for a wife. He'd already gone after Ellen's sister Mary, and that hadn't been very successful. So now he's going after Ellen, and that wasn't going to be very successful because he wasn't a particularly, inviting guy. He wasn't, handsome or anything like that. But anyway, so he happened to be over visiting her on this one evening, and he said, Ellen, I'm going to this concert this evening. I was supposed to go with, I think his name was Jeff. I'm supposed to go with Jeff. But he can't go tonight. He has some reason he can't go. So I have this extra ticket. So she said, well, maybe Jim would be willing to go. So I said, sure, I'm happy to go. So he and I went to this classical music concert somewhere on the University of Washington campus. And it's a good concert. And afterwards he said, well, would you like to meet Jeff? So I said, sure, let's go. I got nothing but time, So we went over to Jeff's apartment, and we sat around, chatting about this and that. And I was absolutely bowled over by this guy, because even though he was sort of a science math wonk, I think he was a theoretical mathematician or something like that. Very high flown, kind of a academic pursuit. But so even though he was that kind of a guy, he was very articulate when it came to the arts, music and literature and history, and we must have sat there talking for a couple of hours, the three of us, and I was really impressed with this guy. And so when I finally got back over to Ellen's apartment, I remember saying to her, Ellen, I met this guy tonight. If I were a girl, that is the kind of guy I would want to marry. right? And I don't think she knew him at all. I just, mentioned this to her. Remember that anecdote, because it's going to come back to bite me in the butt later on. So anyway, I eventually went back to Calgary, and I had a new plan now. What I was going to do, I had discovered that it was possible to get high school teaching jobs in Canada in certain places, but not in other places. In British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, in those 4 western provinces, you had to have not only a Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Science degree, you also had to have a Bachelor of Education degree over and above that, which I did not have. I just had a BA, right? However, from Ontario East, there were all sorts of different ways by which you could become a high school teacher without having a BEd. And I discovered that in Nova Scotia, there were something like, what I assumed were 66 school boards. And these 66 school boards would allow you to teach without a BEd if you went into what was called the emergency program. And the way that worked was, if there was a school willing to offer you a teaching position, then you would take some courses during the summer before that first year of teaching in your subject area, whether it was geography or history or math or whatever, right? So you would take some courses in that area, and then you would teach that year. Then if you wanted to continue on, if you had a job offer for the next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, 4 years of teaching and 4 summer school sessions would get you a BEd. So I sat down, and this was in the days before computers, of course, right? I typed off 66 individual letters to the 66 school boards in Nova Scotia. I mean, they were identically worded, but each one of them was individually typed. They weren't photocopied or anything like that. They were individually, okay? And I sent these 66 letters down to Seattle to Ellen. Ellen then mailed out those 66 letters to the 66 school boards, right? Well, not one of them replied, right? And it was only later that I discovered that these were 66 municipal school boards. There actually were other school boards besides these. And one of them happened to be at Horton District High School, right? They had their own individual school board just for that one school. Can you believe that nowadays, right? So it turns out that the principal at Horton was talking to somebody in Wolfville, and he said, God, we got some openings at the school. This is in the days of the baby boom, right? There are just thousands of kids, in school. And we've got nobody to fill the positions. And this guy from Wolfville said, well, I just got a letter the other day from this guy down in Seattle, who is interested in teaching. And so the principal said, well, I can you give me his name and address, right? And I'll see if he wants to teach at Horton. So he sent a letter down to Seattle, down to Ellen's address, thinking that's where I was living, of course, right? Saying, well, we've got this. In fact, I still have the letter to this day. It says we have this position that's open, and if you have any friends, we have a couple of other positions that are open as well. Well, when I tell this story, to teachers nowadays, or student teachers, they're just bowled over by that, because you can't find a job in some cases anywhere. And here they were offering me a job sight unseen, and not only that, but if I had a couple more friends, bring them along too, because we got jobs for them, right? So this letter went down to, as I said, to Seattle. In the meantime, she also received a letter from Digby, and she also received a letter from Annapolis Royal. So I actually had 3 job offers from the Valley area, right? And so I went down to the Calgary Library, and I said, okay, I'm in the position of choosing now, right? I get to have my choice of 3 different ones. So I'm going to do some research and find out, well, what's Digby like, what's Annapolis Royal like, and what is this Wolfville, Nova Scotia like, right? So on the basis of that, I opted for Wolfville. And I tell the story that I base that on three different things. Number one, Wolfville was a university town, and I still had a lot of interest. I still do, in the arts, having access to a good library, all that sort of stuff. So obviously, Wolfville would be ahead of Digby and Annapolis Royal in that respect. Number two, Wolfville was closer to Halifax than the other two places were. And I figured if there's anything going on in Nova Scotia, it's probably happening in Halifax. So the nearer I can be to it, the better. And then number three, I took a look at the map, and Wolfville was located right on this thing called the Minas Basin. And so I pictured sort of like golden sands and going out sunbathing and swimming and all that sort of stuff. Well, when I got here and I saw the mud flats, I knew that I missed it on that particular score, right? And so I left Calgary, I think it was very early July of 1968. I got on the train. I had virtually no money in my pocket whatsoever. I went as far as Toronto. I took the dayliner from Toronto down to Windsor. I was met by friends of mine who happened to be at the University of Michigan and I think Bowling Green State College that summer. So they came across the border and picked me up in Windsor and took me to Detroit, or no, took me to Ann Arbor. They took me to Ann Arbor, and I stayed there for a couple of days because now I was going to have to officially enter Canada, right? By this time, my induction date was passed. This was dangerous on the part of my friends. Again, they were helping somebody who had not shown up for induction. It was dangerous for them to do this, but they picked me up anyway. They drove me back to the border. I showed all my credentials. I showed them my job acceptance, which had been sent to Seattle, Washington. I was allowed into the country. I think it was on the 4th of July, right? So it had been right around this time of the year. I took the train. The dayliner from Windsor back to Toronto, hopped on the train, continued from Toronto on into Halifax, where I was taking a course at Dalhousie.